A very warm welcome, everybody, to my blobby world. This evening, my aim is going to be to add an extra dimension, if I can, to a classic and much loved Canadian stamp, the 1898 map stamp. It's so beloved that you can even buy pillowcases with a stamp printed on it, as you can see. And that extra dimension, well, it's all about the blobs, of course. The red blobs sprinkled so liberally across the world map, all 72 of them to be precise. So please forgive me, for this is not going to be a learned philatelic treatise at all. It's more of an object lesson as to what can happen to you when you stumble down a philatelic rabbit hole that's more like a rabbit warren. And it has exits leading to all four corners of the world. So here's what we're going to cover this evening, very briefly. First of all, why? Why make the journey at all? What was it that attracted me to this particular rabbit hole? Secondly, and about as philatelic as we're going to get all evening, I'm afraid, we'll take a look at the stamp itself and what makes it so special. And next, we'll take a bit of a time trip back 127 years, in fact, to understand the context of the stamp. And then we'll try to make some sense of those 72 red blobs all over the stamp. And having done that, I'm going to take you on a guided tour of those places through maps on stamps and my own travel experiences. And finally, I'll ask myself, where on earth do I go from here? And at that point, there should be time for some Q&A, and perhaps you can help me answer that question. So first of all, why? Why make the journey at all? Well, for me, this stamp represents something of a perfect storm. I'm an enthusiastic stamp collector, and note that I don't for one moment flatter myself as a philatelist. But my interests include Canada and the Commonwealth, as well as flirting with a topical collection of maps on stamps. Secondly, I'm endlessly fascinated by history, especially the historical context of my own heritage, Britain and its empire. I've been particularly inspired by three books: Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which is just brilliant, and he got a Nobel writing prize for that one. Jan Morris's Pax Britannica trilogy, really a remarkable treatise. And then Simon Winchester, who is a UK journalist, I believe, and he wrote a book called Outposts: Journeys to the Surviving Relics of the British Empire, which is really well worth reading and quite easily available in paperback. And my third passion is travel. I've always had a passion for photography ever since I was towed around the world by my parents aged 6 years old. My career was a career in the travel industry, and latterly, for the last 15 years or so, I was hosting and producing Canada's most popular travel show on radio. So I've been fortunate enough to travel to well over 100 countries. And this stamp, therefore, really does represent a bit of a confluence of all three passions. And so on to the stamp itself. This is one of a few multiples that I have, but it perhaps just gives us a moment to sit back and look at it and just admire what I can only say is a little miniature work of art. It's really a glorious stamp. No wonder it's one of, I think, many collectors' favourite stamps. And by the way, if you look carefully at even at this block of four, you can see differences, variations in where all those little bits of red blob are positioned across the stamp. The stamp also benefits hugely from some very detailed and serious philatelic studies, especially Whitney L. Bradley's The Canadian Map Stamp of 1898, a plating study. This was published by the British North America Philatelic Society back in 1989. And I'm going to refer to this in a few slides' time. So on to what makes this stamp really so very special philatelically. Its genesis, of course, as you probably know, was a wish to commemorate the launch of penny postage across the empire. And so it was essentially, and arguably, Canada's first commemorative stamp. William Mullock was the Postmaster General at the time, and you can see him here, seated in all his Victorian splendour. Charles Skinner who had worked on the Jubilee issue and each of the preceding two issues, the numerical issue and the maple leaf issue, he engraved the design for this stamp as well. And the stamp's fame is innovative in several ways. It was, of course, the first Christmas issue in the world. It was the first three-coloured stamp. It was the first stamp to employ more than one printing technique, because the black portion of the design was engraved, whilst the ocean colour and the carmine blobs were actually applied by typography. And of course, it did mark the launch of the penny postage within the British Empire. And at the time, it was the most expensive stamp, apparently, ever printed. It's not a rare stamp, of course, that there were nearly 20 million of them in total, actually 19,927,500 stamps. And apart from Canada postage and Christmas 1898 descriptor on the stamp, you will have noticed that there is another inscription at the base of the stamp. We hold a greater empire than has been. This quote is taken from Sir Lewis Morris's Song of Empire, written to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee of June the 20th, 1887. And if you'll forgive me, it's worth reciting the requisite verse just to immerse oneself in the over-the-top swagger of the empire at that time. For England, England, we our voices raise. Our England, England, in our Queen we praise. We love not war, but only peace. Yet never shall our England's power decrease. Whoever guides our helm of state, let all men know it. England shall be great. We hold a vaster empire than has been. Nigh half the race of man is subject to our Queen. Nigh half the wide, wide earth is ours in fee. And where her rule comes, all are free. And therefore 'tis, O Queen, that we, knit fast in bonds of temperate liberty, rejoice today and make our solemn jubilee. Yeah, well, after that jingoistic hyperbole, onto perhaps more mundane matters. And one of the lovable quirks, I think, of the stamp in question is the colours of the ocean. Between Scott and Stanley Gibbons, there are 5 colours listed, and they're all pretty similarly priced. We don't really know why, I don't think, but there were 2 basic colours used for the ocean, lavender and blue. And from just looking at the postmark datings, it seems that the lavender was used first in 1898 to 9, and was then replaced by the blue in 1899 to 1900, which arguably provided better definition on the stamp. But as many as 10 different colours have actually been recognised by specialist studies. So it's a bit like, when you look at the ocean in different lights and times of day. The block of 4 shown here at the base of the slide is a different variant. It's known as muddy waters. And this isn't a printing shade at all, but a colour changeling caused by the oxidization of the ink. But still, it's a very collectible item because of its striking appearance. So this really is the stamp that just keeps on giving to collectors. There are retouches and re-entries galore to look out for. The major ones, such as the doubling of Canada postage and extra lines around the surrounding cable, are generally valued at something like 4 times more than the basic stamp. It's thought that something like 600 imperforate pairs exist in most of the basic ocean shades. All are without gum, which is how they were thought to have been produced. And examples crop up on eBay, actually with suspicious regularity, but prices are generally around $1,000. The larger sized horizontal format of the stamp facilitates collecting circular date stamp cancels really well, as well as squared circle cancellations, which were still in use. First day of issue postmarks, which is actually the 7th of December, or that was supposed to be Christmas Day itself, well, they're possible, but they are rare, and there's only about 10 covers showing this. Plating possibilities abound. Now I'll get on to the red plate groupings a little later. And finally, for me certainly, a big attraction of this stamp is that it's not an expensive stamp to acquire. You can get them for as low as $2 used and about $10 mint. But there is a huge range in pricing on eBay. So from the stamp, it's time to set foot into our time machine and hurtle back in time for something like 127 years to the year 1898. So just imagine all of yourselves right now sitting there in your top hats or bustle skirts as the 19th century slowly draws to a close. This contemporaneous map is actually from London mapmaker Stanford's, who were founded in 1853, and they're still in the map business today. And it shows that vaster empire than has been. Pink regions denoting the British Empire abound, and with the last unmapped regions fading slowly away, the world's geography has been defined, and much of it is British. Here in 1898, we live in interesting times. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for almost the entirety of most people's lifetimes. William Gladstone, that colossus of 19th century British politics, has only just passed away earlier in the year, aged 88. It's the year that the Yukon Territory was created, carved out of the Northwest Territories. And south of the border, the US has embarked on its own empire-building mission by going to war with Spain and taking Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. It has also just added the Hawaiian Islands in a somewhat cynical coup. And the car, which was only invented 12 years ago, claims its first victim in the Americas when the very unfortunate Henry Hale Bliss is killed by a very early taxi on 8th century on 8th Avenue rather in New York City. Here in the British Empire, well, it's still expanding in 1898. Whilst the North American colonies south of Canada have been lost for over a century, other places are still coming into the empire. The Sudan, Africa's third largest country, arrived just a smidgen too late for inclusion on the stamp, as the decisive Battle of Omdurman has only just been won in September. And believe it or not, Winston Churchill was there as a young reporter to witness the very last British cavalry charge. The British extort a chunk of mainland China opposite Hong Kong on a 99-year lease, and ultimately this would lead to the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. Nigeria in 1898 was actually 3 territories, Lagos, northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria, and is shown as just 1 dot. But the full integration into Nigeria itself would not take place until 1914. British Cameroon and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, were to be spoils of the First World War in 1920, although there seems to have been some clairvoyance shown on the part of the stamp's designer, Warren L. Green, as these do seem to be indicated on our stamp of 1898. So on now to these blobby places. And it was indeed the somewhat clairvoyant Warren L. Green who was chosen to design this stamp, and he's shown there in the top portrait. As he attempted to show off the incredible extent of the British Empire in the final years of Queen Victoria's long reign, he used a map created by George Robert Parkin, who is shown in the bottom picture. Parkin has been described as Canada's most forgotten famous man. He was headmaster at UCC here in Toronto. He was the country's most outspoken imperialist. His son-in-law was Governor General Vincent Massey, and believe it or not, his great-grandson was Michael Ignatieff. But in his quest to show every British territory possible, Green set the printers an impossible task to accurately and consistently place no less than 72 individual red blobs on a map less than 2 by 3 centimeters in size. Not surprisingly, with roller wear and carmine ink shifts, the result in 1898 was that just about every single stamp is different in some way. And so, as a means of trying to create some order out of the chaos, the perfect stamp has been identified to act as a baseline for all others. And that's 1A26. And this is where Whitney L. Bradley's book on the stamp is really invaluable. The 1A26 stamp, shown here on the front cover, is identified as black plate 1, red plate A, and stamp number 26, i.e. the second row on the sheet, sixth stamp from the left. And this perfect stamp is defined as the one with the least number of variations from the original design. Every single map stamp in the sheets of 100 has at least one clear difference from all of its neighbours. So those differences can be compared to this perfect stamp. Over nearly 200 pages of minutely detailed comparisons, Bradley illustrates all the permutations of the little red dots. But he does so as a means of plating the stamp and does little to identify what those red markings might mean geographically. And that's where my geographer's curiosity was piqued. To explore the geography of the 72 geographical locations in detail, I've used the 10 red plate groupings adopted by Bradley on the perfect stamp in his study to denote the empire's regional components on this stamp. And you can see them delineated on the screen now. So number 1 was the Pacific Islands with 14 blobs. 2 was the Indian Ocean and India with 10. 3, the China Sea with 6. 4, the South Atlantic with just 2. Australia and New Zealand were number 5 with 4 blobs. Africa with 8. The Mediterranean with 3. North America and the Caribbean with most, 19 blobs. South America, again, just 2. And Great Britain with 4 blobs. So then I have tried to identify the locations of all the Carmine blobs on this issue, something that, perhaps surprisingly, has only ever been done in part by previous studies, at least as far as I can ascertain, but maybe someone here tonight can put me straight. The next 2 slides show the results of my geographical sleuthing. For each of those 10 red plate groups, I identify the region, the number of blobs, my identification of those blobs, which ranges from the obvious to the obscure, and where pertinent, the modern names of those places. So, for example, the first region here, the Pacific Islands, the 14 possessions that existed in 1898 at the time of the stamp design that most closely align with the red dots. And these are the Solomon Islands, the New Hebrides, or Vanuatu now, Nauru, Gilbert Islands, Kiribati, the Ellis Islands, now Tuvalu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Niue, Cook Islands, Aitutaki, Tokelau Islands, Penrhyn, Christmas Island, or it is now Kiritimati, and Pitcairn. And similarly here for the remaining 5 regions. Africa with its 8 blobs is the most problematic of these, perhaps, with British Somalia, British East Africa, which is both Kenya and Uganda, Southern Africa, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and one non-existent colony in West Africa. Because it seems that Messrs. Green and Parkin were perhaps anticipating another British colony in Africa that somehow failed to materialise. And you can see that sorting out the 19 blobs in North America and the Caribbean is going to be quite the challenge too. Having identified our 72 blobs that are so imperialistically scattered around the world, now let me take you perhaps on a corresponding flying visit to all of those blobby places. So here we go. Hold on to your hats as we travel on a lightning tour around the world in 72 blobs, beginning with the South Sea Islands. Now, I listed these up, of course, a couple of slides back, so I won't go through them all again. But it's worth noting that Pitcairn is shown notably to the north and to the west of its true position, a bit like it was in the Admiralty charts of the 18th century, which allowed the mutineers on the Bounty to occupy the island for decades before being refound again. Christmas Island is the one dot to to the north of the equator, and it shouldn't be confused with the other, and indeed stamp-issuing, Christmas island in the Indian Ocean. This one is now known as Kiritimati and is part of the Republic of Kiribati. With the southern trade winds wafting through the palm trees, let's go and take a closer look at these South Sea islands. This round-the-world trip allows me to share with you a bit of the flavour of the regions that we've identified on the stamp in a couple of ways. First of all, via my thematic collection of maps on stamps, and secondly, via my own personal travel to some of the blobs. So here I show the maps on stamps that range from close-up individual coral atolls to island groups spread out over a vast area of the ocean to stamps of the entire Pacific Ocean that attempt to show the viewer where their little dot is located in the grand scheme of things. My most recent trip to one of these dots was to tiny Pitcairn Island last year. This is one of the most difficult of all the blobby places to visit. It has no airport, it has no harbour, and it is arguably the most remote inhabited place on the planet. I was fortunate to spend a day there and met just about all of the entire island's total population of 42 Pitcairners, including Dennis Christian, the postmaster, who is a direct descendant of Fletcher Christian, who led the mutineers of the Bounty in 1789. To stand on the highest point of this island and gaze out over the endless horizon, knowing that the nearest people are thousands of kilometers away in every single direction, is to really understand just how far flung this particular outpost of empire really is. Well, let's swap the southern breezes of the Pacific Ocean for those of the Indian Ocean as we sort out the 10 blobs here. And they're India, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, of course, Aden, now part of Yemen, Socotra, now part of Yemen, the Seychelles, that has 2 dots, Mauritius, Rodriguez, Maldives, and Chagos Islands. The little-known island of Socotra is the northernmost dot in the Indian Ocean on the map, and it was under the protection of Aden in 1898, so technically part of the British Empire. The Seychelles have been apparently allotted 2 dots, as their islands are so widespread, over 390,000 kilometres of ocean. The Chagos Islands became the British Indian Ocean Territory in 1967, but are in the final stages of handover to Mauritian sovereignty, with a 99-year lease on the military station of Diego Garcia, and you've probably seen this in the news over the recent months. Rodriguez is the sister island to Mauritius, and it lies 560 kilometres east of the parent island, and is again comparatively little known. The maps on the stamps here show a variety of images, including almost inevitably the extinct dodo bird superimposed on a map of Mauritius. The dodo was in fact last seen alive on the island way back in 1662. Now, I've spent some time in India, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, and all 3 have wonderful echoes of the British Raj in the architecture, in their train networks, the tea estates, and in their impenetrable civil service. I've island hopped to 4 of the Seychelles Islands, and they come pretty close to heaven on earth. But my most recent trip was to Mauritius in February 2020, where I saw bits of the poor dodo that have still been preserved in the local museum. The photo is a sunset over Port Louis, the capital of the island. And on leaving this particular red blob on a small cruise ship, we sailed into a new COVID world. Remember, this was February 2020, where every port in the Indian Ocean suddenly refused to allow us to dock. After 2 or 3 weeks sailing around the ocean like the Marie Celeste, with no illness on board whatsoever, but drink running seriously low, Oman finally took pity on us, and we managed to scramble back to Toronto on literally the last flight out. The Far East features 6 blobs: Papua New Guinea, Singapore, Federated Malay States, that's Selangor, Negri Sembilan, Pahang and Perak, British Borneo, including North Borneo, Sarawak and Brunei, Hong Kong, and Wai Hai Wai. And the year 1898 was an interesting one. It's a transitory year for the Federated Malay States, because only those 4 states noted on the slide were actually included at that time. And even on the perfect stamp, the entire dot has actually migrated into Cambodia. The obscure outpost that appears to be in Korea at the top, by the position of the dot, is in fact the least territory of British Wai Hai Wai that comprised 750 square kilometers of China on the coast facing Korea. It's an analogue of Hong Kong. It was acquired actually in the year 1898, the same year the stamp was issued, of course, and it was returned to China in 1930. Whilst it never actually issued postage stamps, it did issue revenue stamps from 1921. The maps on stamps in this part of the world, including one of my very personal favourites at top left, the 1950 $2 George VI definitive, which for me combines design with a detailed map in perfect harmony and great colour. My wanderings here have taken me to Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the amazing island of Borneo. This island, which is the 3rd largest in the world, simply assails all the senses. From diving in the pristine coral reefs to the lush jungles where I came face to face with the endless soulful gaze of an orangutan, I then hiked up to the summit of Southeast Asia's highest mountain. Mount Kinabalu, at over 4,000 meters, rises out of the jungled plains like a colossus. And this photo shows me just below the summit, where lush vegetation gives way to bare rock slabs, providing the perfect perch to see forever. The South Atlantic. Well, it's only got 2 blobs, as you can see here on the left-hand side, St. Helena and Ascension. So Port Tristan da Cunha actually got overlooked to the south of St. Helena, which is a rare case of a missing island on the stamp, because as a rule, Mr. Green did not miss an opportunity to add another dot of Carmen to his map. On many maps, on many of the stamps, additional red blobs appear in the South Atlantic, but these apparently were non-existent ghost colonies. 2 of the 3 islands of the South Atlantic didn't begin stamp issuance until long after our 1898 stamp was issued. St. Helena's first stamp was in 1856, but Ascension's wasn't until 1922, and Tristan was later in 1952. However, they do make up for it with some of the finest maps on stamps ever issued. I particularly admire the 1934 St. Helena Centenary penny halfpenny value, with the images of the British monarchs there gazing balefully down on an island they, of course, never visited. Alas, these islands still remain on my personal bucket list, but the photo is of Ascension Island, which is a remote rock with 800 people aboard that was first settled in 1815. And it was settled with a garrison to protect its sister island of St. Helena, some 1,300 kilometers away, which was where the Emperor Napoleon had been exiled after his Waterloo. Well, all aboard to the Antipodes. Australia and New Zealand are shown with 4 blobs. That's mainland Australia, Tasmania off the southeast coast, and New Zealand has 2 separate blobs, one for each of the main islands. In 1898, Tasmania was still a separate colony and would remain so until 1901. The 2 blobs for the 2 principal islands of New Zealand tend to merge together on many of the stamps, but on the perfect stamp, they are very separate and distinct. Australia's very first stamp in 1913 was, of course, a map stamp in a design that actually endured until 1945. New Zealand's map stamp, shown here, is an appropriate echo of our 1898 Canadian map stamp, in that it was issued in 1923 to commemorate the restoration of penny postage. And of course, I've cheated a little with the Tasmania example, as Tasmania, unlike some of the mainland Australian states, never actually issued a map stamp itself. I've been fortunate enough to visit these two countries several times, from the glaciers of the Southern Alps to the red centre of the Australian deserts. The photo here is from one of my on-location radio shows in Rotorua, North Island, New Zealand, where I was taping some sound effects of the hissing of the volcanic fumaroles, or as my youngest son said at the time, "Oh God, Dad is interviewing the rocks again." Well, our sixth region is perhaps one of the toughest. Africa has 8 blobs, which I identify as British Somalia, British East Africa, including Kenya and Uganda, Southern Africa, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Gold Coast, now Ghana, and this one non-existent ghost colony in West Africa. The large and very well-defined Carmen blob in Southern Africa is further defined by a black northern border, which makes it clear that not only the colonies of South Africa, Bechuanaland, Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland were included, but also, and incorrectly, Southwest Africa and Mozambique as well. Southwest Africa was actually under German control in 1898 and only became part of the empire after the First World War. Mozambique was never part of the empire, but somewhat surprisingly joined the British Commonwealth in 1995. In West Africa, there is clearly a consistent extra colony that never actually existed. British Togoland was not formed until 1916, and British Cameroon not until 1922, and then it was the wrong side of Nigeria anyway. Liberia looks the closest geographical contender, but it was never a colony of any country. So perhaps this was a case of a blob too far, this ghost colony of Africa. There's no shortage of African examples of maps on stamps. Here, as elsewhere, my preference is for those from the classic era of George V, George VI, and the early years of Elizabeth II. I've been privileged enough to visit most of these former colonies over the years, many on safaris and some on adventure travel jaunts. In fact, I actually honeymooned with my wife in Africa's smallest country, the Gambia, 46 years ago. And a while back, I trekked to the top of the continent's highest mountain, Kilimanjaro, as shown here in my pre-dawn summit photo as the light crept over the plains of Africa in an absolutely unforgettable panorama. From the top of Africa to the bottom of Europe. The Mediterranean region should be simple, right? Yeah, not so much. The 3 blobs are clearly meant to represent Gibraltar, Malta, and Cyprus. And although these 3 locations are clearly the colonies intended, their position varies wildly on most of the map stamps, with Cyprus and Malta often straying out of the Mediterranean altogether and floating over Asia Minor, whilst Gibraltar wanders sometimes off into the Atlantic, or indeed climbs up to the peaks of the Pyrenees. So take a look at next time you see one of the map stamps. But also a mysterious extra blob often appears in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's exactly where ancient Atlantis is supposed to have existed. So it's very otherworldly indeed. Gibraltar and Malta have no maps on stamps at all from the classic period, but Cyprus makes up for it with some very fine ones, notably the one shown here from the George VI 1938 definitives. All 3 of the outposts of empire were very popular tourist destinations in my days of working in the tourism industry in the UK in the 1970s and the 1980s, so I used to visit them a lot. I had a particular soft spot for Malta. It's shown here. Its history is nothing less than spectacular, because the British were certainly not the first here. They were preceded by the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Aragonese, the Knights Hospitaller, and the French. It's truly the crossroads of the Mediterranean. And its 7 megalithic temples are some of the oldest freestanding structures to be found anywhere in the world, predating Stonehenge and the pyramids. Well, let's pop home for a moment to look at Region 8 on the map stamp. And I've divided Bradley's region here into two to make our blob detective work a little bit easier. So North America has 5 blobs: Canada, mainland and Arctic islands, Vancouver Island, the Queen Charlotte Islands or Haida Gwaii, and Newfoundland. Not surprisingly, as befits the second largest country on Earth, Canada has the biggest blob of all, and these 5 in total. Mainland Canada is the biggest splodge, with the Arctic islands receiving a secondary blob. 2 blobs off the west coast represent Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii separately, and on the east coast, Newfoundland was still a separate colony, of course, in 1898. On many of the stamps, if you have a look, you'll actually find that all 5 of these blobs merge into one large area of crimson. Canada has, as I'm sure you know, issued many fine maps on stamps over the years, including the one that we're talking about tonight. I admire the Canada Day 1981 set shown here on the slide as a fine way of combining both history and geography. I emigrated from the UK in 1995 with my wife and 2 young sons. We were very grateful to be accepted as Canadian citizens, and we wanted to show our boys the country that had embraced us all. So we vowed to take them on trips to all 13 provinces and territories in our first 10 years here, which we successfully did, instilling an even greater love of this fine country of ours. This photo is one of me atop a mountain in the Yukon called the King's Throne, which is a day's return hike that rewards with the most immense views imaginable over Kathleen Lake and the peaks of the Kluane National Park. Let's continue our journey to the second part of Region 8, which is the Caribbean. It has 15 blobs, which takes some sorting out. So here is what I believe the designer was trying to show. You have Bermuda at the top, which is not strictly in the Caribbean, Belize on the Central American mainland. The Bahamas have 2 blobs on a similar basis to the 2 given to the Seychelles, inasmuch they're spread over 14,000 square kilometers of ocean. 2 blobs were given to the group of the Windward Islands, which include St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Dominica. And 3 dots cover the Leeward Islands, including St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, Antigua, and the British Virgin Islands. And then individual blobs for Turks and Caicos, Cayman Islands, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago. And these last 2 were still actually separate colonies in 1898, but they were joined together in 1899, literally just weeks after the stamp was issued. With maps on stamps, there is generally an inverse law at work. The smaller the stamp issuing country, the more maps on stamps that it produces. I think it's probably to show where their country is in the world and they don't get lost. And so it is with these tiny Caribbean nations. They have all produced multiple map issues, and I've only been able to fit a few on this slide. But it does include a noble stamp from the Cayman Islands at the foot of this slide, which makes the most of their meagre geography to present all 3 islands in the group. In my work as radio host and producer for the travel shows on News Talk 1010 and Zoomer Radio, I've travelled to and reported from all of these Caribbean blobs. That was a tough job, but somebody had to do it. I was also able to combine all of this travel with another passion of mine, which is running. I've been a runner for most of my life, and I've competed in 3 marathons in the Caribbean. The photo on screen is crossing the finishing line in Barbados in 31 degrees heat. The best bit of the entire race was then taking a few extra steps to fling myself into the ocean from a silky coral sand beach. South America. Well, South America looks pretty bare of blobs, but there are a couple, one at the top, one at the bottom. British Guiana in the north, which is now Guyana, of course, and the Falkland Islands in the south. This is the simplest grouping of all, as both are very identifiable and less prone to wandering around this particular part of the planet. Having said that, though, the Falklands have been known to migrate across the sea to the mainland of Argentina, which is a bit of a political red flag, of course. There's no shortage of map stamps from both of these places. The Falklands in particular have been very keen to put themselves on the map philatelically, with issues from the 1933 centenary threepenny, shown here top left, to modern £2 definitives. Of course, Argentina has also issued many maps on stamps showing the Falklands, or the Islas Malvinas, as they call them. But that's a different story from the one I'm telling tonight. I was lucky enough to actually visit the Falklands 6 years ago, as you can see from this photo. It really does feel like the last outpost of empire. 3,500 hardy folk live in a land devoid of trees, where there are many more penguins than people, and where Union Jacks in every window show their continued loyalty to the crown. Incidentally, the colonies of king penguins here are simply mesmerizing, truly one of the greatest wildlife experiences I have ever seen. And finally, let's travel to the 10th and last of our map stamp regions, the motherland itself, the British Isles, with its 4 blobs: UK, Ireland, Orkneys and Shetland. The whole island of Ireland was still a part of the UK until 1922, when it became the Irish Free State. So it is entirely covered in crimson on the stamp. The 2 dots to the north of the British mainland appear to represent the Orkney Islands and the Shetland Islands. I think the likely reason why they were given their own blobs is an attempt to give greater bulk to the mother homeland on the map. And on some stamps, these two become untethered to the mainland entirely, and they drift northwards in the Atlantic to join Iceland in the very top of the North Atlantic, perhaps attracted by their shared Viking heritage. Great Britain has never been a prolific map on stamp producer. Perhaps as the birth mother of the empire, it felt it didn't need to tell everybody what and where it was in the world. For the most part, we have to be satisfied with secondary depictions, such as the Concord and NPY issues shown here. Ireland was much less constrained, and its very first definitive stamps featured an Irish map in 1922, which was, interestingly, a map of the whole island, including Northern Ireland. Naturally, as I spent my first 40 years of life in Britain, there are a few parts that I haven't ventured to. So I thought instead I'd show you a photo of me in Ireland, in the act of kissing the Blarney Stone atop Blarney Castle in Cork in Southern Ireland. Perhaps it was this that enabled me to take on the job of live radio host as the final act of my travel career. And so we come to the last chapter of this story. Where on earth do I go from here? Well, it would be interesting to visit the last vestiges of empire remaining today. These are the 16 British overseas territories that still belong to Britain, shown on this map. Simon Winchester has written an excellent book on these places that I mentioned earlier, called Outposts: Journeys to the Surviving Relics of the British Empire. Really do recommend it. It's a good read. The total population of all 16 of these is only 270,000, with half of that in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands alone. I've been to 8 of them already, but others still await. And the journey doesn't finish there. It would be good to perhaps visit some of the other red blobs on the stamp that are no longer part of the empire. Over the last couple of years, I've added Belize and Pitcairn to the tally, but I've still got 28 to go, so there's plenty of scope here. And very happily, many of the missing blobs are actually in the South Pacific, so that's pretty inviting in itself. And besides the travel, there's the stamp itself. Canada Post has celebrated the stamp here with a commemorative issue in 1998, celebrating the centenary of the stamp. It features Queen Victoria's crown, a portrait of Postmaster General Sir William Mullock, and a reproduction of the original stamp. But interestingly, only 7 million were actually printed, which is about 1/3 of the number of the original stamp in 1898. In its news release to accompany the stamp, Canada Post rather naively said, and I quote, "For collectors who may only have dreamed of having an authentic penny stamp in their private collections, this new issue may be an affordable consolation," unquote. Well, with the original costing sometimes as little as $2, I don't think they quite got it. So, where next for me with this stamp? Well, so far I've accumulated nearly 300 copies as my kind of stage one. Stage two will be to group the blob variations that I currently have. And then stage three will be to work out the ones that I don't have. Stage four, of course, would be to seek and acquire those that I don't. And eventually I could perhaps aim to create an exhibit. I've never done this. I know so many of you have, but it would be a first for me. So maybe that's where my next challenge lies. So we conclude our trip around the world and the empire upon which the sun never set, thanks to the magic of our 1898 Canada map stamp. In the 72 steps along the way, we've covered the immensity of Canada and the obscurity of Wai. We have identified ghost colonies, long-lost Atlantis, and missing islands. We've embraced the uncanny foresight of including countries that were not yet part of the empire, but would soon become so. And it's not bad for a stamp whose size is just 1/3 that of a credit card. I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as I have. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have.